Hey, amazing viewers! Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. A night of no return. The air inside the hospital room was thick with the scent of antiseptic, masking the underlying traces of fear and uncertainty. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a sterile glow over the pale blue walls. The rhythmic beeping of machines filled the silence, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside the door. Emily Carter lay on the hospital bed, her small hands clenched tightly around the thin, scratchy sheets. She was shaking, though whether from fear or the sheer exhaustion of labor, she couldn't tell. 14 years old, alone, and about to bring not one, but 3 new lives into the world. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at the ceiling, the pressure in her abdomen growing unbearable. It was happening. There was no more running, no more hiding, no more hoping that somehow this was all a nightmare she'd wake up from. This was real. She was about to be a mother. A sharp contraction shot through her, stealing the breath from her lungs. Emily let out a strangled cry, her fingers digging into the bedrail as she fought against the pain. Her body convulsed, beads of sweat forming on her brow. I can't do this," she gasped, panic clawing its way up her throat. The door swung open, and a woman in scrubs entered, mid-40s, dark auburn hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes filled with quiet determination. Nurse Grace Whitman. Grace had been in delivery rooms for over 2 decades, but something about the sight of the trembling girl before her hit her like a punch to the chest. The desperation in Emily's eyes, the way her small frame curled inward as if trying to disappear. It was a sight Grace had seen too many times before, but never quite like this. This girl was just a child herself. Emily. Grace's voice was gentle but firm as she approached the bed, placing a cool hand on the girl's arm. Emily flinched at the touch, her breath ragged. "I can't," she choked, her lips trembling. "I don't know how to do this. I'm not ready. I can't be a mom." Grace kneeled beside her, making sure their eyes met. "I know you're scared," she said, her tone unwavering. "But you're not alone. I promise you, we're going to get through this, one step at a time. You don't have to do this by yourself." Emily's wide, glassy eyes searched Grace's face as though trying to believe her. But how could she? Her parents had kicked her out the moment they found out she was pregnant. Ryan, the father of her babies, had promised they'd figure it out together. But he had disappeared as soon as things got tough, his last words to her echoing in her mind like a cruel joke. "I'm not ready to be a dad. I never wanted this." Neither did she, but here she was, alone. A fresh wave of contractions tore through her, cutting off her thoughts. Emily screamed, her body arching off the bed as agony ripped through her. The room blurred around her, panic setting in. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. "And no," she whimpered, shaking her head violently. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Grace cut in, her voice steady. She pressed a cold cloth to Emily's forehead, her presence like an anchor amidst the storm. "You are already doing it, Emily. And you are stronger than you know." Emily sobbed as another contraction gripped her, squeezing the air from her lungs. The room filled with the sound of frantic movement. Doctors preparing, nurses checking vitals, but all Emily could focus on was the sheer, unbearable weight of what was happening. Then suddenly, a voice. "You got this, sweetheart." Emily's body jerked at the sound. It was so familiar. Her heart pounded as she turned her head toward the door. And there, standing just inside the room, was a woman she never thought she'd see again. Her mother. A moment of silence stretched between them. Emily's chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths as she tried to process what she was seeing. Her mother, who had thrown her out, who had called her a disgrace, who had told her never to come back, was standing there, her hands gripping the strap of her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Tears filled Emily's eyes, a mixture of anger, pain, and longing bubbling to the surface. "Why?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother swallowed hard, her own eyes glistening. I came as soon as I heard," she murmured. A strangled laugh escaped Emily's lips. "As soon as you heard," she choked, her voice bitter. "I've been alone this whole time, and now you care." The room was thick with tension. Grace exchanged a look with one of the other nurses before gently stepping back, allowing Emily and her mother this moment. "I know I don't deserve to be here," her mother admitted, stepping closer. "And I know I hurt you." Emily clenched her jaw, turning her head away. Another contraction hit, and she screamed, squeezing her eyes shut. Her mother rushed to her side. Instinctively, she reached for Emily's hand, but the girl yanked it away. "Don't." Emily spat, her voice raw. Her mother hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair beside the bed, wringing her hands. "Emily, I made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. I should have never let you go through this alone." Emily's throat tightened. She wanted to scream at her. She wanted to tell her how much she had suffered. But another contraction stole her voice. A doctor rushed in. "She's fully dilated. It's time." Everything happened so fast. Emily barely had time to process what was going on before she was being instructed to push. She gritted her teeth, her screams filling the room. And then, a cry, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the chaos. Emily's body went limp against the bed, her breath hitching in her throat. Through the haze of exhaustion, she barely registered the small, wriggling baby being held up before her. Grace smiled gently. "It's a girl, Emily. You did it." Tears blurred Emily's vision as she stared at the tiny life she had brought into the world. Her mother reached for her hand again. And this time, Emily didn't pull away. The weight of 3 lives. Emily's body sagged against the bed, every muscle trembling from exhaustion. She could barely keep her eyes open. Yet she forced herself to look at the tiny newborn wrapped in a soft white hospital blanket. Her daughter. Her daughter. The words felt foreign, unreal, like they belonged to someone else's story. Not hers. She was just a kid. How could she be a mother? A warm hand squeezed her own. Emily turned her head weakly and met her mother's tear-filled gaze. The same woman who had thrown her out was now sitting at her bedside, her grip firm, as if afraid to let go again. "I'm here," her mother whispered. Emily should have felt something. Anger, relief, betrayal, longing. But all she felt was numb. She didn't have time to process it. Another sharp contraction tore through her body, dragging her back into reality. Emily let out a strangled cry, her fingers curling into the sheets. "Emily." Nurse Grace's voice broke through the haze. "You still have 2 more to go, sweetheart. You can do this." Emily wanted to scream. She had already pushed herself past her breaking point. There was no way she had anything left to give. "I can't," she whimpered, fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. Grace leaned closer, her voice steady, unshakable. "Yes, you can. And you will." Emily's chest heaved. Every part of her wanted to quit. But then, a cry. A tiny, soft wail filled the room, and Emily turned her head just enough to see the first newborn being gently placed into an incubator by one of the nurses. Her baby. Her baby was alive. Something stirred deep inside her, a faint ember of strength buried beneath layers of fear and doubt. She had already done this once, and she could do it again. With a shaking breath, Emily gritted her teeth and pushed. The mistake no one saw coming. The second baby came faster than the first. A boy. As soon as his piercing cry filled the air, Emily slumped back against the pillows, her skin slick with sweat. But the room remained tense. Emily's eyes fluttered open, just enough to notice something was wrong. The doctors and nurses were moving too quickly, their hushed voices filled with urgency. One of the nurses glanced toward the incubator, her face tight with concern. Emily's heart clenched. "Tell you what's wrong?" she rasped, barely able to speak. Nurse Grace's face remained calm, but Emily caught the flicker of worry in her eyes. "The babies are small, Emily," she said carefully. "We need to monitor them closely." Emily's stomach twisted. She knew what that meant. Premature. Her body had been too young, too fragile to carry triplets to full term. And now, her babies, her tiny, innocent babies, were fighting for their lives. Emily's mother stiffened beside her, her grip tightening. "They're going to be okay," she whispered, almost like she was trying to convince herself as much as Emily. But Emily wasn't sure if she believed her. Her chest tightened. Panic began to claw at her throat. But then, another contraction. She was out of time. There was still one more left. The last one was different. The final delivery felt like it took an eternity. Emily screamed through the pain, her body begging for mercy. And then, silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Emily's heart stopped. Where was the cry? She tried to lift her head, but her body wouldn't move. The room filled with quiet murmurs, hands moving quickly, shadows flickering across the bright fluorescent light. Then, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "She's not breathing." The words stabbed through Emily like a knife. Her third baby, her last baby, her little girl wasn't breathing. Emily's vision blurred as pure terror gripped her. Her throat was raw from screaming. But it didn't matter. She needed to scream again. She needed to do something. She has to be okay. Emily sobbed, her entire body shaking violently. Nurse Grace moved quickly, stepping toward the small bassinet where the lifeless newborn lay. The other nurses worked frantically, checking vitals, moving wires, administering oxygen. Emily's mother let out a shaky breath beside her, her hand still wrapped tightly around her daughter's. For the first time since walking into the hospital, she looked completely helpless. Seconds passed like hours. Emily couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She barely heard the frantic whispers between doctors. Then, the smallest, weakest sound. A tiny, fragile gasp. And then, a cry. Not loud, not strong. But there. Emily let out a sob, her entire body collapsing with relief. Nurse Grace exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging as she gently touched the baby's tiny head. "There we go, sweetheart." The medical team didn't stop working, but Emily knew. Her baby was alive. She didn't know how. She didn't know if she would make it through the night. But right now, she was alive. Emily let out a broken, exhausted laugh. She had done it. She had survived. And so had they. But the hardest part was yet to come. The delivery was over, but Emily's body was still trembling, her eyes fluttering closed as her entire world went black. The last thing she heard before slipping into unconsciousness was her mother's voice. "I'm not leaving you again." But as Emily drifted into the darkness, one final thought gripped her mind. What if she already had? What if it was too late? A mother's strength is born. Deep, heavy silence settled in the hospital room. Emily drifted between the edge of consciousness and the overwhelming exhaustion pulling her under. Her limbs were leaden, her body sore beyond words. She tried to open her eyes, but the darkness was too thick. Somewhere in the haze, a voice. Soft, uncertain, afraid. Emily. Her mother's voice. Emily wanted to respond, to ask what had happened, to ask if the babies, her babies, were okay. But her body refused to obey. She felt something. A hand, warm and trembling, brushing against hers. Then another voice. Firmer, steadier. She's stable, but she needs rest. Nurse Grace. Emily forced herself to focus. The weight of reality was crushing her, pressing into her like a giant stone. She had done it. She had given birth to 3 babies. But at what cost? As her mind struggled to surface, memories slammed into her like a tidal wave. The unbearable pain, the fear, the moment she realized her third baby wasn't breathing. Her stomach twisted. Was she okay? The weight of the unknown settled over her like a blanket soaked in ice water. And then, the darkness swallowed her whole once more. Hours later, a new battle begins. When Emily finally opened her eyes, the world felt different. The hospital ceiling above her came into focus, the soft hum of machines filling the room. Her body was still sore, but she could move. Slowly, she turned her head and froze. Her mother sat beside her, curled in the chair, arms wrapped around herself. Her face was pale, dark circles carved beneath her eyes, as though she hadn't slept at all. The sight sent a ripple of emotion through Emily's chest. Anger, hurt, confusion. She hadn't been here before. Not when Emily needed her. So why now? As if sensing her gaze, her mother stirred. Her eyes fluttered open and immediately landed on Emily's face. Emily braced herself. But instead of speaking, her mother's lips parted, and silent tears fell. Emily's breath hitched. She had never seen her mother cry. Not once. Not even when she had screamed at Emily to get out. Not even when she had slammed the door in her face. But now she was crying. Before Emily could say a word, the door creaked open. Grace entered, her calm presence filling the room like a quiet storm. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Emily swallowed. Her throat was dry, her voice scratchy. Where are they?" She didn't need to say more. Grace's expression softened, and she nodded. "They're in the NICU." Emily's stomach clenched. She had known deep down that the triplets would need special care, but hearing it out loud made it real. She pushed herself up in bed, wincing at the pain. "I need to see them." Grace hesitated, but something in Emily's face must have convinced her not to argue. "All right, but we'll go slowly, okay?" Emily swung her legs over the side of the bed, her head spinning. Everything felt surreal. Her mother stood as if to help, but Emily flinched away. "I don't need your help." Her mother's face crumpled, but she nodded, stepping back. Emily didn't look at her again. With Grace's steady hand on her back, she moved toward the door. Every step sent a dull ache through her body. But nothing could prepare her for what she was about to see. Inside the NICU, the truth no one told her. The neonatal intensive care unit felt like another world. A sterile hum filled the air. The room was dim, soft monitors beeping in quiet rhythm. Tiny incubators lined the space, each holding a fragile, delicate life. Emily's breath hitched as she spotted them. 3 tiny bundles. So small, so vulnerable. Her feet felt glued to the floor. She had carried them inside her for so long. Felt them kick, felt their tiny movements. And yet now, they felt like strangers, as if they weren't hers at all. She slowly approached the first incubator. The baby girl, the firstborn, her daughter. Emily reached out, her fingers hovering over the glass. She was so impossibly small, her tiny chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Emily swallowed hard. "She's strong," Grace said softly beside her. "They all are." Emily turned her gaze to the second incubator. Her son. A tiny oxygen tube was secured to his face, his minuscule fingers curled into delicate fists. Emily's heart clenched. She barely registered her mother standing nearby, watching her, hands trembling at her sides. Then, the last incubator. Emily hesitated. Her third baby. The one who hadn't cried. The one who had been silent for too long. She took a breath and stepped closer. And then her heart stopped. The doctor beside the incubator sighed, his eyes kind but weary. "She's fighting, Emily." Emily couldn't breathe. Her third daughter looked even smaller than the others. Too small. The machines beaked around her. A feeding tube. IVs. So many wires. So many things keeping her alive. She had difficulty breathing on her own. the doctor explained. "We're doing everything we can." Emily pressed a hand against the glass. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Her daughter, her flesh and blood, was fighting for her life. She swallowed the lump in her throat and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't ready for you. I'm sorry I was scared. I'm sorry I didn't love you the moment I saw you." Tears blurred her vision. A soft hand touched her shoulder. For the first time, Emily didn't pull away. She turned and looked up at her mother, who was crying, too. "I was wrong," her mother whispered, voice trembling. "I was so wrong." Emily wanted to scream, to yell, to say every angry word stuck in her chest. But instead, she let herself cry. Because in that moment, she wasn't just a daughter. She was a mother. And for the first time, she understood how much love and pain could exist in the same heart. The breaking point. The fluorescent glow of the NICU bathed the room in an eerie stillness. The rhythmic beeping of the machines, the faint hum of the oxygen tubes, the occasional shuffle of a nurse's footsteps, all of it blurred together in Emily's mind as she stood frozen, staring through the glass of the incubator. She had seen Tiny before, but not like this. Her third baby, the one who had struggled to breathe, looked too fragile for this world. Her skin was pink and wrinkled, her fingers barely the length of Emily's fingernail. A thin tube ran into her nose, and a monitor beeped steadily beside her, tracking every tiny heartbeat. Emily's chest tightened painfully. She felt like an imposter standing there. Her daughter was fighting to live. And yet, all Emily could feel was the weight of her own failures. "You can touch her," a nurse beside her said softly. "She'll know it's you." Emily hesitated, her fingers trembling just inches from the incubator. Would she? Would this tiny baby even want to know her? The girl who had been too scared to love her. She swallowed hard, pressing her palm gently against the glass. The warmth seeped into her skin, and something inside her broke. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, so softly she wasn't sure anyone heard her. But someone did. Her mother. Emily felt her presence behind her before she even spoke. "I didn't either," her mother murmured, voice raw. Emily tensed. She had spent months hating this woman, the woman who had abandoned her when she needed her most. Now she wanted to yell, to scream, to demand why she was here now when she had thrown Emily away before. But when she turned around, ready to let the anger spill out, she saw something unexpected. Her mother's face, so much like her own, was crumpled in silent grief. "I was scared," she whispered. "When I found out you were pregnant, I thought if I pushed you away, I could pretend it wasn't happening. That I could protect you by pretending this wasn't real." Emily's jaw clenched, but her mother continued before she could speak. "But it was real," she whispered, voice trembling. "And I failed you." Emily wasn't expecting that. She had braced herself for excuses, for half-hearted apologies that wouldn't change anything. But this was different. This was her mother admitting she was wrong. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," her mother said, tears glistening in her eyes. "But I'm here, and I don't want to leave you alone again." Emily's throat tightened. She wanted to push her away, wanted to tell her she didn't need her anymore. But the truth was, she did. Not just for herself, for her babies. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, Emily let out a shaky breath and whispered, "I don't know how to do this." Her mother nodded, tears slipping silently down her face. "Then we'll figure it out together." The impossible decision. The days blurred together after that. Emily's body ached from the delivery, her exhaustion bone deep, but she forced herself to push through. Every morning, she shuffled her way into the NICU, heart pounding in her chest as she checked on the triplets. Her first two, a boy and a girl, were growing stronger every day. They still needed oxygen, but they were gaining weight, their cries growing louder. Her third baby, though, she was different. Emily could barely breathe every time she approached her incubator, terrified that this would be the moment she wouldn't make it. She watched helplessly as the doctors hovered over her, whispering things Emily didn't understand. Then one afternoon, Grace walked into the room with a look on her face that made Emily's stomach drop. "What?" Emily asked, immediately on edge. Grace hesitated. "We need to talk about your daughter's condition." Emily's breath caught. "Is she getting worse?" Grace didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Emily's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had already been through so much. Was the universe really going to take her baby away from her now? Grace motioned toward a chair, but Emily refused to sit. She needed to be strong. "Your daughter is still fighting," Grace said gently, "but she needs more specialized care than we can provide here." Emily's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" Grace sighed. "There's a neonatal facility an hour from here that specializes in premature cases like hers. They have a better chance of helping her than we do." Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. An hour away. No, she couldn't let them take her baby. I'll go with her," Emily said quickly. "I'll do whatever I have to." But Grace's face softened in that way that meant she was about to say something Emily didn't want to hear. "You can't, sweetheart," she said. "Not right now." Emily felt like the room was closing in on her. Her baby was struggling to survive, and they were telling her she had to let her go. Her hands trembled as she turned to Grace, voice shaking. You're saying I have to send her away." Grace hesitated. "I know it's not what you want to hear." Emily took a step back, her vision blurring with panic. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to let go. Suddenly, her mother stepped forward, placing a steady hand on her back. Emily tensed, but didn't pull away. Her mother squeezed her shoulder. "I know this is hard," she whispered, "but this is what's best for her." Emily's chest ached. She wanted to fight, wanted to scream and tell them they were wrong. But when she turned back to the incubator, she saw the truth. Her baby was struggling, and she needed help Emily couldn't give her. Emily felt her heart crack into pieces. She closed her eyes, inhaling sharply before whispering, "Okay." She had just made the hardest decision of her life, and she wasn't sure she would ever be the same again. The strength of letting go. The next morning, Emily stood outside the hospital as the ambulance doors closed, carrying her smallest, most fragile baby away from her. Tears streamed down her face, her body shaking. Her mother stood beside her, silent but strong. Emily had spent so long hating this woman. But now she was grateful she wasn't alone. Because this was the hardest moment of her life. And she wasn't sure she could survive it without someone holding her up. Emily watched until the ambulance disappeared. And then, for the first time in days, she let herself collapse into her mother's arms. And for the first time, her mother held her like she would never let go. A mother's fight. The world outside the hospital was cold and gray, a perfect mirror of the emptiness swelling inside Emily's chest. She stood motionless, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as she watched the ambulance carrying her smallest, most fragile baby disappear down the road. A piece of her was leaving with it. She had spent months terrified of becoming a mother, of failing, of not being enough. But now, standing here, the pain of letting go was worse than any fear she had ever known. She felt her mother beside her, silent, but present. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily didn't pull away. Her mother exhaled shakily. "She's going to be okay." Emily wanted to believe that. But after everything that had happened, she knew better than to hold on to hope too tightly. Nothing in life was guaranteed. Not love. Not security. Not even family. She had learned that lesson the hard way. But one thing she did know. She wasn't the same scared, abandoned girl she had been just a few days ago. She was something else now. Something stronger. She was a mother. And that meant she had a fight to win. The first step forward. Emily returned to her hospital room in a daze. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her, But sleep refused to come. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the emptiness of the room like a physical ache. Her body had changed. Her world had changed. And yet here she was, alone in this bed, just like before. Her first 2 babies were still in the NICU. She hadn't held them yet, hadn't even fed them. What kind of mother was she? A bad one, her mind whispered cruelly. A failure. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, but she refused to let them fall. Not this time. She sat up, gripping the sheets beneath her. She wasn't going to sit here and drown in self-pity. She had already lost so much. She wouldn't lose them, too. Facing fear, one touch at a time. The next morning, Emily took her first unsteady steps back into the NICU. The nurses gave her warm, reassuring smiles, but she barely noticed. All she saw were the incubators, her babies, her children. Her stomach twisted as she approached the first one, the tiny, delicate girl who had come into this world fighting. "She's getting stronger," Nurse Grace said softly, standing beside her. "She's been waiting for you." Emily swallowed hard. I don't know what to do," she admitted, voice small. Grace smiled, placing a gentle hand on her back. "Just be here. That's enough." Emily hesitated, and then, with slow, trembling hands, she reached into the incubator and touched her daughter for the first time. Her skin was warm, impossibly soft beneath Emily's fingertips, and just like that, the fear shattered. She wasn't a failure. She wasn't an imposter. She was their mother. And they needed her. A shaky breath escaped Emily's lips as a tear rolled down her cheek. It was real now. She was ready. A second chance at family. Over the next few days, Emily did everything she could to be present. She held her son for the first time, feeling his tiny fingers wrap around hers. She whispered to her daughter, telling her stories about a life she had once been too scared to imagine. And all the while, her mother was there, never pushing, never forcing her way in. Just waiting, hoping. On the third night, Emily found herself standing outside her mother's hospital room. She didn't know why she was there. Or maybe she did. Her mother looked up when she walked in, surprise flashing across her face. Emily stood awkwardly in the doorway. She hesitated. "I don't know how to forgive you." Her mother nodded slowly. "I don't expect you to." A long silence stretched between them. Then, Emily spoke the words she never thought she'd say. "But I think I need you." Her mother's breath hitched. And then, for the first time in months, Emily let herself be held. The moment that changed everything. A week passed before the hospital called with news. Emily sat frozen in the NICU, her heart pounding. Her third daughter, the one she had feared she would lose, was ready to come home. Emily couldn't believe it. She was still small, still fragile. But she was here. Alive. Hers. The moment they placed her in Emily's arms, everything else disappeared. The past didn't matter. The mistakes, the fear, the pain, it was all just noise, because she had her family now. A family she had built from the ashes of everything she had lost. A family she would never give up on. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily knew she wasn't alone anymore. Epilogue. A love that never leaves. 3 years later, laughter echoed through the small living room as Emily sat on the floor, watching her 3 toddlers chase each other in circles. Her daughter, the firstborn, was giggling as she tried to catch her brother. Her son ran behind her, a mischievous grin on his face. And her smallest baby, the one who had once fought for every breath, stood tall and strong, eyes full of life. Emily felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had once been so foreign. She had been scared. She had been abandoned. She had nearly lost everything. But in the end, she had found something greater than fear. She had found love. She had found family. And this time, no one was leaving. A love that never leaves. The sky outside was painted in soft hues of orange and pink. the last whispers of daylight fading into the horizon. Emily stood by the window of her tiny apartment, watching as the streetlights flickered on, illuminating the quiet neighborhood below. Behind her, the familiar chaos of 3 toddlers filled the room. Small feet stomping against the floor, giggles ringing through the air, the occasional sound of a toy crashing to the ground. This was her life now. Messy, loud, imperfect, but full. She turned back to the scene unfolding in front of her. Her daughter, the firstborn, sat cross-legged on the floor, cradling her favorite stuffed bunny, while explaining something very serious to her little brother, who listened intently, before promptly throwing a toy truck across the room. And then, there was her smallest baby, the one who had been a whisper away from never coming home. She was standing on the couch, arms stretched wide, grinning from ear to ear. Strong, alive, unstoppable. Emily's heart swelled at the sight. She had spent so long fearing that she wouldn't be enough, that she wouldn't deserve these little souls who had chosen her as their mother. But looking at them now, laughing, playing, thriving, she knew. She had made it. They had all made it. A knock on the door broke her from her thoughts. She smiled, already knowing who it was. When she opened it, her mother stood there, holding a bag of groceries in one hand and a box of homemade cookies in the other. "Thought I'd stop by," she said softly. Emily smirked. "You do that every day." Her mother shrugged. "Well, I'm making up for lost time." Emily held her gaze for a moment before stepping aside, letting her in. It was still hard sometimes. The past couldn't be erased. But she had learned something important in the last 3 years. Love wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, again and again, no matter how many times you failed. And right now, in this small apartment, surrounded by her children, with the mother she once thought she had lost standing in front of her, Emily knew one thing for certain. She was never alone again. She never would be. She took a deep breath, then turned back toward the mess, the noise, the beautiful, chaotic love that filled the room. And then, with a soft laugh, she whispered to herself, "We did it." This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.